Good afternoon. So let's try this again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. So I want to build on what we began to talk about last week. So on Monday, and that is that African Americans had a civil society, and that is civil society. By that I mean society outside the state, that where people have their social networks, their continuities, and so. And one of the interesting things that has come out of that, those connections, is a kind of leadership out of a black congregation, particularly the clergy. And now, in this discussion, I'm going to talk too much about men, but males have dominated in some ways the kind of conversation about American politics for a number of reasons, as we can see. And see if my little thing works. So let's try this again. So there are a host of characters. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there are some things that I really want you to pay attention to. One, it says indigenous community organization. Black churches are indigenous community organizations, and it's an indigenous because it is controlled by the people at the very lowest level, at the ground level. And I don't mean that in low in terms of status, but at the ground level. And therefore, you see this other word, it creates its own organic leadership. So a leadership that belongs to its own community. And that we'll talk about a little bit more some of these terms: ecclesial politics, electoral politics, protest politics, national public personalities. All of those go in there. But one of the things that you'll note is that black clergy people, whether male or female, have to build a support system, have to be affirmed by its own people. That's what I mean by organic leadership. And that organic leadership is crucial to black churches, black American politics, and so on. In 1972, this is one of the few books that tries to examine black politics, by Charles V. Hamilton, called The Black Preacher in America. It came out in 1972. Professor Hamilton is still alive. He is a political scientist, and he is best known for a book he wrote, co-authored with Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation. And you can see up at the top there, it's highlighted, The Politics of Liberation. So Professor Hamilton began to study, in some ways, clergy behavior, and he ended up writing a book on one of the people we'll talk about, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the political biography of an American dilemma. So, and he kept on studying, and very few people have studied activist clergy, with the exception of Martin Luther King Jr., who gets a lot of ink like Abraham Lincoln now, right? I mean, more ink is spilled on Lincoln than anybody. So the Black Preacher in America, and he wanted to take this wide sweep in the 1970s to look at it. And this book comes in the context of a book you already read by Albert Rabateau. The Rabateau's book, there were a group of books coming out shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So all of these books were coming out after the assassination of King as a minister, King as a leader. There were just a number of books coming out, and people were thinking about what did Black history mean, it's particularly in the era of Black power. And what does that mean in a revision of Black history? And of course, if I can get this to work. So you can see that in the 1970s, along with your book by Al Rabateau, there were tons of books coming out about slavery, revising the kind of estimation of slavery, and all of them made reference to slave communities and slave churches and the invisible institution, as Rabbitoh would call it. All of them made references to this, or Jean Genovese asked the question, why didn't slaves in the United States rebel more? Why didn't they rebel like they might have done in, say, a place like Haiti? What kept slaves from rebellion? And what he comes up with, his Marxist formulation, is that there's a kind of paternalism, and that religion was one thing that kept slaves from rebelling. So these were kind of books that were coming out. The Slave Community wanted to revise, by John Blassingame, wanted to revise how people understood what was going on at the time. And I give you the backdrop of the books is because it's important for understand that this conversation is in an academic conversation with other books, right? So if you thought about it for a moment, if you thought really hard and about what's going on, in 1920s, the American academic establishment wrote that pretty much that slavery was a good thing, and that people were happy with them, and that after Reconstruction, African Americans were no place to be in politics, and so they kind of got wrote out of politics. So this was then a kind of reversal of this. This became a long-going conversation through the late 1950s, through the early, through the 60s, through the 70s, and of course we keep getting new studies. But I just wanted to put the context in here for you to understand Hamilton's book on the black preacher in America. So what was that role? Was it the role of pacification? Was it the role of charlatan? And so forth. Now, the context for black preachers is this. Black preachers are as much American as apple pie. And what I mean by that is that black preachers come out of the same stuff that white American preachers come out. So the same stuff that you might have heard of Billy Graham or Billy Sunday or from George Whitefield in the 18th century down, Richard Allen, all of those are coming out of the kind of same source material. They're using the Bible. They're evangelical in the Protestant sense. And of course, they are showmen. All religious leaders have to be showmen. And I don't mean that insultingly. I mean that as if you say the Mass, you have to be a performer. If you're a rabbi, people want you to be an excellent orator. They don't want to be bored when you give expression. So in some ways, there's all of this performance that goes with this. And so African Americans, though, are in this oppressive situation of slavery, and then post-slavery, building institutions so that people can live. So by politics, I mean how black religious leaders engage the state locally, regionally, or nationally pertaining to laws and publicly supported social inequities. I love this. This was taking place in Harlem. Here lies Jim Crow, a funeral service for Jim Crow that took place on the street. So the social inequities: Jim Crow, racial apartheid; Jane Crow, sexual apartheid. Voting, economic disparities. Black ministers, in a way different than their white counterparts, have had to encounter not just the kind of religious lives of their own people, but the very laws that constrict the lives of their people. And it's important to note that for a while, not now, but for a while, the clergy were the most educated people in the United States. So we forget in the 19th century that many of the people who were educated were clergy. This is why Morehouse College was called Atlanta Baptist Seminary. Spelman College was Atlanta Baptist Seminary for Women, and so forth. These were the educated people, and therefore they would take a place in leadership. And of course, we have now gone over and over again the institutional parameters of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, with the starting Wilberforce College. These were the educated people, and normally your educated people become leaders, spokespersons, whatever the case may be. Because we created indigenous institutions, that the politics of black people learn politics internal to their institution. So ecclesiopolitics is first, right? Where's your politics begin? Inside the church organization, inside the temple organization, inside the rabbi, and so forth. So this is where the ecclesiopolitics become very important, because it's a training ground. So if you want to learn how to lead, you need to have an organization to lead. So the women's auxiliaries, such as we've read about in the Women of the Church of God in Christ, all of those are places where people get training to have leadership, and they learn how to play politics. How do you organize your coalition within the church to get something done? Or how do you gonna persuade the clergy that your program is valuable? So church politics was the first. As I told you about my grandfather, he became a deacon on Sunday, and that was a very important role. That was a very political role, because you had to be elected deacon in your church. You just didn't become a deacon. And then, you wanted to remain on the deacon board. So you had to learn how to Robert's Rules of Order, procedure. Ecclesiopolitics, it was a training ground. Even at the church that you think has no similar organization, it has organization. And everybody forgets that was an indigenous learning training. My grandmother, born in 1906, understood Robert's Rules of Order better than people I see running the meetings here at KU. And she could rule you. She had a 7th grade education. She could rule you out of order and knew all of the procedures. And I was like, where did you learn all that? She's like, well, we do this at our church meetings. We take minutes. We take copious notes. We know what is going, and so forth. So ecclesiopolitics. And then there's ecclesiopolitics between the clergy. That is, if you're in an episcopacy system, right, a hierarchical system, right, a bishop system, you run for bishop. Now, how are you going to become a bishop? Now, there are people who self-appoint themselves bishops, right, and they start an organization and they start calling themselves bishops. But there are also people that you have to have that conferred by the people and the other clergy to vote you up the sort of chain. And that also requires organizing in politics. So there's nothing like going to a Baptist convention, an AME convention, a church convention of any sort, to watch the politics happen, because people operate at a very high level. And this was a training ground for a lot of the people. So this ecclesiopolitics is a part of that indigenous organizing that is going on, right? Making sure that people learn the rules of order. I want to give you one example. These are 2 Baptist ministers. The one is Joseph H. Jackson. He was the head of the National Baptist Convention. And the other one you well recognize was Martin Luther King Jr. King wanted Joseph Jackson, a Chicagoan then, to be more aggressive about civil rights. And Joseph H. Jackson did not want to do that at all. He thought that, that the church shouldn't be in politics. And I'm going to see if I can switch here for a minute, if it'll work for me. Come on, come on. Something's spinning there. All right. It's slow. So in Kansas City, in about 1961, the National Baptists met in Kansas City, and there was a controversial action going on. So this is from the King's, and you should look at this site, the King Global site. As a controversial leader of the National Baptist Convention, he wasn't controversial. He was elected over and over again, even if he had to do it kind of semi-fraudulently. You know, he's like a political leader, right? Jackson often clashed with other Baptist ministers, including Martin Luther King Jr., who believed Jackson's opposition to the use of civil disobedience to achieve civil rights was too conservative. So you got to persuade your people at the convention who should be in. So Jackson was not an uneducated man, very sophisticated, born in Mississippi, went to Jackson College, which is now Jackson State University, then went to Colgate Rochester Divinity School up in Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass is buried. And then he came out here to the Midwest, went to the interesting place to get an MA at a Jesuit school, Creighton University, up north from us in Omaha. He was ordained as a Baptist minister and so forth. And so he resisted the civil rights impetus by King and others because he thought that the church shouldn't be in politics. But the thing about Jackson was, in Chicago, he was very much in politics. He was very much aligned with Mayor Richard Daley. He was very much aligned with Daley and others because he wanted his people to get jobs. He wanted his people to get things. And in Chicago politics meant that you had to be aligned with the machine, the Daley machine. So while he, on the one hand, was saying, no, I don't want the National Baptists to be involved in this civil rights too much, he, on the other hand, in Chicago politics, tried to be kind of like a mini political boss. So anyway, and by 1960, there is an alt-right battle to take over the convention from Jackson. And at the 1961 convention, you see in this paragraph, in Kansas City, Missouri, down the block from us, Jackson and Taylor both claimed the presidency. There were two people who, Gardner Taylor, who was a famous black preacher from New York City, Brooklyn, right, Concord Baptist Church, and a scuffle broke out. And a man got pushed off the stage and died. Now, you know, Baptist ministers, you know, all churches can get in a scuffle, but they got in a scuffle. Of course, what happened is that Jackson would blame King for this and write scurrilous op-eds. But I mean to tell you that this is the internal politics of a community. And however bad this might seem, this was a struggle, and it led to the formation of another Baptist convention called the Progressive Baptist. Remember I told you, one Baptist can't really tell another Baptist what to do? These are the internal organizing politics of a community. And so, but all of them knew the procedures, the ways of moving, and there was always a power struggle. A power struggle for who will run the institutional levers of the community. During Reconstruction, there were roughly 2,000 black elected officials nationally, and they were all males given the 15th Amendment, and roughly a third or more were clergy. I pointed out to you Henry McNeil Turner was in the Georgia State House the other day, that he, as an AME bishop, and they were a part of it because they were the reading populace. Now the question was, whether or not these clergy people were on the side of their own people, or whether on the side of, or were they too easy to compromise. This is the question that scholars ask all the time. Do they compromise? Are they selling out the people? And there's a myth all the ways that black clergy are selling out their people for their own self-interest. Some are, some aren't. But this is a kind of thing that black clergy had to be the spokesman because many of them, not all of them, had access to the kind of education it was needed to make kind of legislation. One thing that you have to understand, black faith and religion grew up in oppression. So it had to speak of protest politics, right? It had to always address the issue of inequity, not in this, not as a matter of a local church issue, but as a national issue. Slavery was a national, international in many ways. Slavery went from Argentina to all the way up to North America and through the Caribbean. So clergy were always speaking. This one particular clergyman, Henry Highland Garnett, really wanted to say, like he called for slave rebellion, that he believed that slaves should rebel against their masters. One, he thought this because, first of all, he said it violated his own theological proposition, the Sabbath. He said slavery violates the Sabbath. And so scholars often miss this point of his, is like, this is a violation of the Sabbath, and that means that this is not a God-given institution, as the slaveholders have called. They are damaging people. They are working people. Even God took a day off on the seventh day, and the Sabbath ought to be honored. Slavery had stretched its dark wings of death over the land. The church stood silently by. The priests prophesied falsely, and the people loved to have it so. Its throne is established, and now it reigns triumphant. Nearly 3 million of your fellow citizens are prohibited by law and public opinion, which in this country is stronger than law, from reading the book of life. You couldn't even read the Bible because slaves couldn't read. It was against the law. So he's a good Protestant. What's the book? It's the Bible for him. The Protestant version of the Bible, right? He dies and is buried in Monrovia, Liberia. So like Henry McNeill Turner, people began to think, oh, maybe I should return to the African continent. But you see, this is a long tradition of people protesting the very public sphere. This is not a new thing in black life. Women's movements within black Protestant churches are also a political ground. More women, scholars study club women a great deal, but more women went to church than they did join black women's clubs. I probably get hit by some of my scholar friends who study black club movements, but more women went to church. More ordinary women went to church, and this is where they learned their politics. They first learned their politics sometimes in support of or against their clergy. Sometimes they learned politics in support of or against their clergy. One, if they didn't agree with their clergy, they would hold funds. Two, if they wanted their clergy person out, they would whisper. Three, many of them were married to the deacons if they were Baptists or other forms, and they would say, get that person out. So it's a form of politics going on. And also, black clergy, as I've told you before, are trying to make sure that they don't make sure that women don't amass too much power. So it's a power struggle, sometimes about who's going to control. Women's movement within black Protestant churches are all over. Methodists, Episcopal, you go name it. And of course, our reading was from women of the Church of God in Christ, right? I'm going to move up a minute, because this is my man. Reverend Ike, you see T.D. Jakes, Creflo Dollar. If you're a student of black churches, you watch these people. And if you haven't seen them, you can go on YouTube and see them. Reverend Ike is one of the most fascinating Americans. And why I jump is because most people associate black clergy with a Reverend Ike or the big televangelist. But he's kind of the father of televangelists and the prosperity gospel. And that's been around a long time. Before Reverend Ike, there was, in American history, was Norman Vincent Peale, right? Be happy, think and grow rich, all of this other stuff, positive attitude, right? Faith. So having good faith, what people think confers values. These have always been with in the American psychics from the 19th century. Being positive, being self-reliant. Well, but there was nobody quite like Ike in this regard. See if my so this is from the New York Times. This is his obit. And in the these were kind of lines that Ike used. You see in the third paragraph here. He says, "Close your eyes and see green." Right? Would tell his 5,000 parishioners with a red carpeted stage at the former Lowe's Palace on 175th Street in Washington Heights. That's way uptown past Harlem in New York. Now, much of it is a Dominican neighborhood. This headquarters of his United Church of Science Living Institute. Money up to your armpits, a room full of money, and there you are just tossing it around in it like a swimming pool, like the cartoon character, Little Richie Rich. His exhortation, as quoted by the New York Times in 1972, was vivid sampling of Reverend Ike's philosophy, which was variously called Prosperity Now, Positive Self-Image Psychology, or just plain Thinkonomics. You just got to think of it, and you'll get it. And people associate all of black clergy with kind of Ikes or those beyond it. But even the Ikes had a social role. And we'll get to that. But then we have another kind of black clergy outside of Protestantism in the Nation of Islam. Debate stemming from a claim to have consequent alternative theology as a challenge to the state. Now, Elijah Muhammad is probably most misunderstood and misinterpreted in many ways because his faith was nationalist. He believed that black people were priority, and his cosmology came that way. I'm going to see if this will work for us, but there's a little part of an interview I want to show you.
We can say a devil cat out there, a devil element, a devil we could call most any grafted thing a devil, you see. But actually when we say Satan, we mean a man or a people that their weakness is not Satan. confined to themselves. It spreads, and the others is affected by their wickedness. And the white man, we say, is the devil. Why? Because of his weak, physically coming into being from the original man.
The reason I will show you part of this is that Elijah Muhammad built an organization with a kind of interesting conglomeration of Christian theology, of Islam, to try to pose for people an identity outside of the state-sanctioned black identity. That is, in his era, you were born Negro, you died Negro, and you were impoverished. And he is trying to come up with a cosmology that's different. And that he is trying to reshape the minds of people he considers that are poor, misguided, and he is trying to build an organization where they have some strength of identity. Now, his targets were people who were migrating from the South, like he did. His targets were people who had substance abuse, like he had once had in Detroit. His targets were these people, and he tried not to make himself known too much until a discovery of the Nation of Islam by television, by this guy Mike Wallace, in a documentary, The Hate That Produces Hate, that came on television, that they discovered that there was a whole Nation of Islam. Now, I know you all know about Malcolm X, but nobody really knew this organization outside the black community really until it hits television. And he has a substantial following of people in major cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York. And he's trying to give an alternative identity. My colleague at Princeton, her name is Judith Weisenfeld, has written a wonderful book about these kinds of organizations like the nation is under, called New World Coming, about great migration religion, about the transfer. And for someone like Elijah Muhammad, he sees the problem is the old style Christian churches are the real problem here, because it pacifies, as he argues, it pacifies the people. And he wants something that will make them self-reliant. Now, he's not that much different in the practicality of what the Church of God in Christ is doing. Modesty of dress, head covering, good work ethic, family life, in theory. So, but this group, along with Marcus Garvey, becomes the target of FBI investigations already, right? Because these are alternative. And Elijah Muhammad is a little bit controversial, because he was rooting for the Japanese, because he said that's a colored people might defeat these Europeans. There's a long history of black people being, till World War II, being enamored with the Japanese as a colored people that might beat back the European imperialism, without questioning the imperialism of the Japanese, right? So he's got an alternative. And secondly, he goes to jail because he refuses to fight in World War II. So he is seen as a threat to the state, whereas the other people we're talking about have not been seen as a threat to the state in its politics. One of the great characters of all time, and very interesting in the Depression era, is Father Divine. I know you all haven't heard of Father Divine. There's Father Divine and there's Daddy Grace, but we're just going to talk about Father Divine. Father Divine also uses his religious notions to offer an alternative. And the first thing you notice is his wife. Right? Now this is the 1930s. In 1967, right? In 1967, the Supreme Court rules against the state of Virginia in Loving versus Virginia on interracial marriages. But he says his religion allows him to marry whoever he wants to. Let's take a little peek at.
From all over the country, followers pour in by car and by special divine-owned buses to pay homage to his name. They receive his blessing from a loudspeaker connected with his inner sanctum. Peace, everyone. Thank you, Lord. Sumptuous is the food, but no pork is raised to the entrance of the little spellbinder these folk choose to call God.
So Father Divine is, but different than Reverend Ike. Actually, Father Divine is feeding people during the Depression. And he is also providing some kind of, that peace mission is supporting some kind of alternative identity for people. So religious identities are different. He's not challenging the kind of structure in the same way that Elijah Muhammad is, but he's in essence doing the same thing, creating businesses, trying to create jobs at the height of the Depression, and creating a sensation. You have a question? Gotta go to the mic.
Okay, so, oh, Jesus. So my question is, why is this on, or?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, my question is, why is it okay, like, why were they calling him God? Like, why is that okay in his eyes? Because usually, like, it's blasphemy if
right.
people are calling other people gods,
right.
and especially, well, I know in the Muslim religion that's really bad, but
right.
also in Christianity
right.
too.
And Judaism as
yeah,
well.
Judaism too. Yeah,
it's blasphemous to
yeah.
call yourself right. He's calling himself God for a number of reasons. One, that he is delivering the manna from heaven,
yeah.
and people buy into it or they go along with it. We can't tell.
Yeah.
You know, some people actually believe. Some people actually like, I'm getting things from this dude, and why it lasts, it lasts. You know, there were attempted investigations of Father Divine's peace mission, and one of I forget how exactly all the details of the story, but one of the kind of investigating people died, and he said, you know, I told you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, because he was using like uppercase G instead of lowercase G.
Yes.
But yeah, that was all I had.
But no, that's a good question.
And were they praying to him?
Huh?
Were they praying to him?
They were giving adoration. We don't know if they're praying to him or just saying, long as he's delivering goods. I mean, this is the tricky part of it, right? We don't know if the people in this, and of course, this is shot to give him more publicity, right?
Yeah.
So it's shot in the positive, but it is a radical alternative than what's going on in the general society. He's breaking rules.
Yeah.
And he's saying religion can break the rules, and that feeds political struggle.
Thanks.
Yeah, you have to go up to.
So he says that his religion allows him to marry whoever he pleases. Was his marriage, like, legal in the eyes of the courts?
That's a good question. We don't know. I mean, there are several different biographies on him, and several different really good books. About 3 of them, as I can think of off the head. You know, we don't know. Was she the money funder or all that? But they were in a relationship. But the difference is that clearly he has also a social mission involved. He's engaging people at their very basic need: food, jobs, businesses. Both he and Elijah Muhammad are in that regard, trying to create a broader infrastructure that provides people for their needs, because the state blocks people from those kinds of things. And by breaking the rules, saying I'm allowed to marry outside my race, well, he's got to be a bad man, because he's doing something that nobody else is doing. The only other person who could get away with that would be Jack Johnson, the boxer. And of course, he got jail time, but not Father Divine. One of the great churches that was established in the United States that still exists in 1808 is Abyssinian Baptist Church. Abyssinian is one of the names that you can look up, used for Ethiopia, right? Or a part of Ethiopia, the kingdom Abyssinian. And this very fair man in the back there is the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. And he will move Abyssinian Baptist Church from sort of roughly its midtown location where Central Park is up, just in the 50s, up to Harlem. And they will build a building in 1925. In fact, the building that all these children are standing in front of. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was a traditional pastor. Now, Harlem had several large churches, all kinds of different churches. St. Philip's Episcopal, Abyssinian, and the list of churches could go on. A sizable Roman Catholic church, all black in this neighborhood. But Abyssinian had this storied history because it will become the storied history of his son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. will inherit the church. And this is a very interesting thing. Churches and religion become, in a number of religions, become the family business. So if I'm the son or daughter of a rabbi, I might become a rabbi. If I'm the son of a daughter of a Baptist minister, I might become a Baptist minister. And I will learn, even if I don't become that, I will learn politics at the foot of my father or grandfather or whoever it was. Adam Clayton Powell was this sort of social gospel. He had all kinds, like Father Divine. They're running roughly contemporary. He has all kinds of social operations coming out of Abyssinian Baptist Church to serve the needs of people who are desperate, who are looking for jobs, looking for the good life. So black preachers have to service their congregations in ways at all kinds of levels, not just, quote, an abstract spirituality, but at the level of jobs and social. The church functions as a social service unit. This is his son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Bon vivant, playboy, Baptist minister, married to jazz and stage actresses. In 1941, he was elected on the Democratic ticket as New York City's first black city council member. After serving on the council for 3 years, Powell in 1944 adopted a progressive civil rights platform, centered on fair employment, and a successful campaign to serve in the House of Representatives, representing Harlem's 22nd district. When Powell took office in 1945, he became the first black congressman from New York State. Now, having Chicago roots, I'm going to say like he's Johnny come lately. You know, I mean, Chicago, we like black congressmen in the 20s. I'm just saying, you know, but there was nobody more flamboyant than Adam. Yes. Yep.
What was his, he looks very white. Is he?
Whoa. Yes. Well, but that's, black people can look white, right?
Yeah, but, so I was wondering, was his mom black? Was his, like,
No, his mom was very fair skinned.
Just.
Because, you know, we have this crazy rule in the United States, right? I mean, the racial drop of one drop of whatever blood of some sub-Saharan African, you are black. And the Pauls proudly claim their blackness. Even though Adam was originally born with blonde hair and blue eyes, you see his baby pictures, you know, he's like, no, but, you know, he's black and his father's black, and they are the blackest of black, right? So let me give you a little clip of Adam.
A young slave boy stood one day before the greatest ruler of his day. And God said to Moses, "What's in your hand?" And Moses said, "Lord, only I've got a stick, that's all." He said, "Well, let me use what's in your hand." And God used that slave boy with a stick in his hand to divide the Red Seas, march through a wilderness, bring water out of rocks, manna from heaven, and bring his people to freedom land. What's in your hand? What's in your hand? One with God, always in the majority, so walk with him, and talk with him, and work with him, and stick together, and fight together, and with God's hand in your hand, the victory will be accomplished here, sooner than you dreamed, sooner than you hoped, sooner than you prayed for, sooner than you imagined. Good night, and God bless you.
So Adam was a stem winder, cool, all those things, and he led in the Congress till he was unceremoniously put out of Congress in the late 1960s. Adam, unfortunately or fortunately, had a little trouble in an island called Bimini. That island seems to be a very sticky place for politicians. Both he and presidential candidate Gary Hart, both probably got caught on the monkey business. Let me put it that way. And others. Again, the father-son business and this leadership and political. Martin Luther King Jr. is the skin of Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., and he was the grandson of Reverend Albert Daniel Williams, the second pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So that went in line of succession. His brother, A.D. Albert, named after his grandfather, was also a Baptist minister. So the kind of ways that one learns leadership is in the kind of context of the ecclesial politics, right? How to galvanize people, how to bring people together, how to win a majority. All those things are useful when you go into electoral politics, whether you're the mayor. And of course, we don't live far from Kansas City here. We have a sitting congressperson representing the city of Kansas City, Missouri, Emmanuel Cleaver II, right? He is an ordained Methodist minister. So these kinds of ways that the training ground for family is the politics. So politics becomes very, very important because anytime you're running an organization, you're engaged in politics. Whether you're the school principal or you're the superintendent, you still have to bring people together. And how are you going to do that? And when there are oppositions to your point of view, these are the kinds of questions that These are kind of training grounds where people learn their politics. It's at the local level. So black people learn politics from their local organizations. One of the few women that I want to point out to you is a woman I met when I was a high school student, Addie Wyatt. Her maiden name was once Cameron. Addie L. Wyatt, 1924 and 12. And Wyatt worked as a meat packer between 1941 and 1954, combining that with looking after children, organizing the Wyatt Choral Assembly with her husband, and an increased involvement with the labor union, United Packing House and Food Alliance Workers Union. By the early 50s, she was a well-known activist, and in 1953 was elected vice president of her branch, Local 56, becoming the first black woman to hold a senior office in an American labor union. In 1955, Wyatt was ordained into the Church of God, not the Church of God in Christ, but there's another Church of God where her husband was already a minister. Now Wyatt worked on the south side of Chicago organizing labor. And they served together at the Vernon Avenue Church of God in Christ in Chicago. And she was quite the dynamic person. Once again, she's not at the national level. You don't read about Addie Wyatt at the national level, but she is an operator. She understands both the internal politics of the church, because she's married to a minister and becomes one herself, but she's also a labor organizer. Again, having the experience of bringing people together to work. I'm going to show you a bit of an interview with her, talking about her labor experience. She's older than.
I was impressed. How could two young black women meet with two white bosses and achieve the success that we had achieved at that time? I was told that it was because of the union. It was a violation of the union contract, and she explained it to me. And I was really moved to the extent that I wanted to do something to help this union. I didn't know what the union was, but I know that I needed help. And here was a place that I could get the help. I knew that I wanted to help other workers, and I found out that I could help them by joining with them and making the union strong and powerful enough to bring about change.
So Addie Wyatt combines that with her own religious belief that working people need protections, and that became a very, very important aspect of it. When I met her as a high school student, she was trying to convince us why we should be thinking about what labor meant, not only as a sort of way of keeping wages at a certain level, but what it did for people's lives immediately. How do you protect people's lives? And so for her, she combined both of these things and became a very important local leader in the Chicago area. Outside of Chicago, not a lot of people know about her, but when my era, she was a very, very important local labor leader and religious voice, because she could go into all of those many, many Protestant churches around Chicago and talk about what labor protections meant for ordinary people, why it was important. And she saw this, not in this interview, but she saw this as a religious duty as well. Do you have a question?
So in her in the union, and when she became part of the church, did they just help African American women, or did they also help African American men, in the sense of like
The labor union was for everybody.
Right. No, I'm just asking because was there a sort of kind of specifically detailed way for African American women to get not only be a part of the union and get helped by the union benefits, but also by the church as well?
Yeah, I mean, of course, all we should say in a certain era, all people who attended any kind of black religious organization were working people, and they were not always college-educated working people. They were working people who worked in retail, domestic service. Then cities like Kansas City, Chicago were still, Omaha, still centers of meat packing and other kinds of things, armor and all those other things. And they, if you read the Jungle, some along the line in high school, and it's enough to make you a vegetarian, right? The Jungle, but people worked in these conditions, and so you wanted to make sure people had safe conditions, that they were properly paid. And so she fused her labor organizing with her religious activities. So they became one. And she often will come to work with Jesse Jackson later on. Yeah. Bill Gray, not too many people know about him, but the other day I mentioned Florida Memorial Baptist University down in Miami, right? On PowerPoint the other day I mentioned him. His father was a Baptist minister, so was Bill Gray, and his father was the president of Florida Memorial, right? So he was also a politician. He became the first in the House of Representatives to become the House Majority Whip from 1989 to 91. He served on the House Budget, chairman of the House Budget Committee, and those are all big deals. So, because he who pay attention to the tax proposals going on right now, if you are the chairman of the House Budget Committee, you are a powerful chairman, right? This is something that everybody learned from Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And for all of his interesting dalliances, he was a politician and served on very powerful committees to get legislation through. And that's how you get legislation through. So Powell, Bill Gray, all learned how to work the system and to navigate it. He is the first person. He died in 2013, too early. He became, after leaving Congress, he became the president of the United Negro College Fund. And so to kind of work like, and he's, of course, he is at a very powerful time being at the House, in the House Committee on the Budget, because he's working really with George Bush the First. He has to help shepherd him raising taxes through, because under the Reagan administration, the budget it gets out of kilter and they have to raise taxes, and Bill Gray is it. But if you looked at his background, you could see that he has learned the art of politics, again, through those organizations that he is trained up in. And that is primarily, in his case, the Baptist Church. Jesse Louis Jackson, Sr. People still know who Jesse Jackson is, right? Civil rights leader, famous Chicagoan. Somebody I'm trying to do research on, trying to think about a book project on, particularly as Jackson centers black people running for the presidency. Without Jesse Jackson, 1972 at the Democratic Convention, and then later on in 1984 and 88, there would be no Barack Obama. And so And Jesse Jackson is, in his own ways, controversial. Let's see if my other video will come up. Here's a little bio video on.
After King's assassination in April 1968, Jackson split from the SCLC leadership. He moved to Chicago and in 1971 formed Operation Push.
To make sure that white store owners in the black community did their part of hiring black clerks. You're going to either hire some African Americans in your store or we're going to have a boycott. And he did that and it was quite effective.
Jackson's efforts generated national and international headlines. And in 1979, he traveled to South Africa to speak out against apartheid.
Jesse Jackson came to Israel to support the Palestinian cause. He starts using the same phrases he used in the United States. I am somebody. Say it with me. I am somebody. And they're repeating this in Arabic.
In 1984, he formed the Rainbow Coalition to fight for equal rights for everyone. That group later merged with Operation Push. That same year, Jackson ran for president. He came in third in the Democratic primaries. Then in 1988, he ran and lost again.
He told me, he says, I know I'm going to get elected president. I know it's not possible for a black man to be elected president. And of course that wasn't true.
When the returns came in 2008 and Obama was on the stage, there were shots of Jackson with tears in his eyes.
Jackson is a Baptist minister and civil rights leader who continues to fight for equality. His oldest son, Jesse Jackson Jr., served in the U.S. House of Representatives.
The friend of the downtrodden, friend of African Americans, and that's the role he's played. He is always there. When there's trouble, Jesse's going to come.
Well, so that's a very favorable video of Jesse Jackson. When I was working in Chicago, kids in the projects would call Reverend Jackson Messy Jesse. So it's a, you know, but the point is that that this unique position is been carved out. That it's not just a religious role. It has taken on other social significance for everyone. Any last questions? And then I'm done. I would like to tell you to pay attention to William Barber, who started Moral Mondays in North Carolina, and is attempting to start a poor people's movement in the United States. Again, the same tradition that people's spiritual needs are also political. Thank you.